I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. The rain had begun sometime in the early hours, a slow, unobtrusive weeping that blurred the edges of Oxford into something half-remembered. It traced the ancient contours of stone and slate, pattering with patient reverence across centuries of architecture. Even the pigeons, usually defiant in their perches, had found recesses in which to sulk. I had wandered through Radcliffe Square with my coat collar turned up, and no clear destination, save for the one that required no invitation, the chapel of St. Frideswides. Inside, the world rearranged itself around sound and stillness, the hush of damp air, the soft creak of wooden pews, and above all the slow, deliberate swell of the organ, not triumphant or mournful, but exploratory. Each note lingered as if hesitant to move forward, echoing through stone ribs and settling like dust upon the bones of old benefactors. I took a seat near the rear, less for anonymity than for perspective. The organist, a narrow man with a powdered wig of thinning silver hair, was barely visible in profile. His fingers moved without urgency, lost in some private conversation between him and habit. At the far side, the janitor, or verger if we're to respect college affectations, polished the brass candlesticks with the solemnity of a priest anointing relics. His shoulders stooped not from age, but a life shaped by corners and corridors few ever noticed. I had come under the pretense of waiting. For what? I couldn't have said with any conviction. Perhaps I hoped that in returning to a chapel I had not entered since a May service long ago, when I still believed the universe might provide answers through architecture. Something unresolved might shift, or stir. Instead, it was a scent that first disturbed the quiet. Candle wax, yes, but richer, older, not from the votives flickering near the altar, but something that suggested extinguishment rather than flame. The smell of rituals long concluded. And then footsteps, not loud but certain. Stone does not forgive the weight of movement, and the crypt beneath the chapel, usually sealed, had whispered back. No one else seemed to notice. The organist, half dreaming through Purcell, carried on. The janitor bent deeper into his task. But the footsteps had been real. Not a creak, not a figment. Two descending, two ascending, as if someone had changed their mind partway down. Dawn came to mind, as he often does when the air thickens with something unnamed. Our critical day is not the very day of our death, but the whole course of our life. I had read that line once beside a hospital bed in Cowley. It meant one thing then. Another now. I turned slightly and saw the verger straighten, then pause as if some minor calculation had failed to resolve. He looked toward the crypt door, then away again. His cloth, still in hand, trembled almost imperceptibly. That kind of fierce a memory does not come from ghosts, only from people. A detail returned to me. The organist had not turned a page. In 20 minutes he had moved through a single phrase, again and again. I had heard it at least 6 times now, each with a hesitation on the 4th chord. Deliberate. A signal? No, too theatrical. But perhaps habitual. Somewhere beneath us the crypt had settled back into silence. I found my hands clasped as if in prayer, though no words came. Only an unease that threaded itself between pew and pillar, note and absence. Nothing, I told myself. As I rose and moved toward the south transept, past brass and marble and names barely legible with time, nothing is ever truly buried. Only misplaced, forgotten until the wrong question is asked in the right place. Outside the drizzle persisted, now finer, more insistent. I stood beneath the chapel's stone arch and lit a cigarette I didn't need, watching smoke curl like incense. I knew then, without evidence or cause, that the week ahead would not be kind. Something had stirred, and however faint its signal, it had chosen to reach me. The rain had eased by morning, but left the streets looking as if the night had not quite finished grieving. The pavements bore a glistening sheen, a cold varnish over worn stone, and the scent of damp paper clung to my fingers as I folded back the Oxford Mail. It was the kind of headline that should have remained buried near the classifieds, a courtesy nod to the academically departed. But there it was, nestled above a misplaced recipe for trout in aspic. Local historian found dead in locked room, Professor Edwin Martin. A name that, though not familiar in my personal circles, carried its own reputation among the more bookish denizens of the Bodleian and the archivally inclined. He had been a fixture of St. Friddeswyde's for decades, its unofficial guardian of parchment and myth. His articles, dense, precise, faintly mournful, had once filled the footnotes of better men's books. There had always been something solitary about those who choose to live among the dead, even if only in ink. The report was as brief as it was convenient. Discovered by a porter during the early rounds. Door locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. A half-finished glass of whiskey on the nightstand. Doctor's note suggested heart failure, though no autopsy had yet been performed. I sipped my lukewarm tea and let the sentence breathe. Heart failure is always welcome at the breakfast table. Respectable, quiet. It makes no fuss and leaves the linen unsullied. But what caught at me, what refused to settle, was the final line, offered with the kind of careless flourish that tends to be overlooked by those who haven't spent a lifetime suspecting that nothing truly ends without a reason. Martin had, according to the college's bursar, been working late nights on a genealogical theory related to the crypt beneath the chapel. A whisper in academic terms. A rumor if spoken aloud. I folded the paper back along its spine and stared at the headline again. Locked rooms appeal to the same part of the mind as crossword clues. All premise, no explanation. And Oxford, in its quieter moods, has always been a place that prefers its mysteries insoluble. Too many answers in one place invite the kind of attention that disturbs the dust. My own visit to the chapel the evening before returned to me with curious symmetry. The crypt, the footsteps, the organist's stubborn repetition, and that unnameable weight in the air, not quite foreboding, but something that had chosen not to speak. I dressed without ceremony and made my way to the lodge at St. Friddeswyde's, whose gatekeeper was a man named Purdy. He had once failed a degree in divinity and had since committed himself to the doctrine of small talk. When I inquired, with a tone more casual than it felt, about Professor Martin, his brow furrowed in that slow-motion performance the English reserve for sudden news. Terrible, that. Poor soul. Always had a weak constitution, mind you. Never quite recovered from the stroke last Easter. Kept himself to himself. Very late hours recently. Up to something, I'd say. I asked about the porter who'd found him. Purdy nodded toward the quadrangle. Young fellow named Lyle knew this term. Didn't say much, just ran straight to the dean. The room was locked, mind. Had to break the latch. I thanked him more from habit than civility and stepped onto the flagstones. Already the quiet was turning clinical. There would be a tidy inquest, a hesitant eulogy, and the slow redistribution of a dead man's books. But if Martin had indeed uncovered something beneath that chapel, something unrecorded or inconvenient, it would not lie long in peace. Some truths refuse to remain archivally entombed. Heart failure. It always begins there. But history, I have learned, tends to kill in slower, cleverer ways. It was Lewis, with his mild vowels and air of tactful sincerity, who made himself useful in the drawing-room above. The Dean of St. Friddeswyde's, a man with hair like melting chalk and the manner of someone permanently apologizing for a raincoat left in a pew, was explaining the tragic suddenness of Professor Martin's passing. Lewis nodded at all the right pauses, tilted his head sympathetically, asked gentle questions about Martin's research interests. I left him to it. His decency, which I'd once considered a hindrance, had become useful camouflage. The chapel door gave with a soft groan, as if aware it had been out of use. The light inside was thin and ecclesiastical, not cold precisely, but indifferent. It scattered unevenly across the worn flagstones, where centuries of knees and sorrow had left their indentations. I passed the altar, resisting the impulse to glance upward to the carved angels overhead. They always seemed to be listening for something even they could no longer name. The undercroft steps were narrower than I remembered. Not treacherous, but the sort that required intent. A visitor would not descend idly. The air changed by degrees as I moved lower, coolness giving way to the denser, more secretive breath of damp earth and exhausted incense. Below, the crypt lay in hush. Not silence exactly. There was always the faint murmur of pipes of settling mortar, the acoustics of places built to mourn, but something below speech. Below explanation. To the left, the crypt's iron-bound door was closed, though not locked. I paused before it, noting the latch. It bore the faint gleam of metal too recently touched. Not polished for show, but disturbed. Not a cleaner's cloth, too perfunctory and but careful fingertips. Hesitant, deciding. I opened the door slowly. The hinges did not squeal. That was what unsettled me. Places like this are supposed to complain. Dust is meant to resist. Yet here all was unnaturally yielding. The air was ranker still inside, thick with the sourness of damp lime and disuse, and candle wax, old wax, burned too close to stone. That scent had haunted me since the organ's fourth chord the night before. To the right of the archway stood a modest wooden table meant for tourist pamphlets and spare hymnals. On it, 3 texts, a book of common prayer, an illustrated guide to the chapel's misericords, and, more peculiar, a psalter. 17th century by the binding, perhaps earlier by the feel. It was shelved too high on the pile, the wrong way round, the grain of its cover running perpendicular to the rest. It was the kind of misplacement no librarian would commit, and no verger would overlook. I drew my finger lightly along the spine. A film of dust had gathered unevenly, as if a thumb had dragged across it and left a smear. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed, annotated in 2 hands, one printed, spidery, the other heavier, recent. Pencil, I thought. Erased, but not wholly. I turned the volume gently, resisting the instinct to read. Not yet. Instead, I stepped closer to the base of the stone wall just beneath the south transept. There on the flagstone's edge, subtle, almost nothing, was a smear of wax. Faint but deliberate, as if someone had steadied a candle too long, while the rest of them waited in darkness. Not a ritual. A reckoning. I stood still, hearing nothing but feeling everything. The crypt held its breath. I imagined Martin here, candle trembling in one hand, book in the other, tracing bloodlines backward through ash and rumour. Whatever he'd found, or feared, had not let him leave quietly. When I emerged into the nave, Lewis was just concluding something courteous about collegial legacies. He looked at me briefly, asking nothing. I gave a faint nod. The dead, it seemed, were growing restless, and someone, I thought, was trying very hard to tidy them away. Helena Martin greeted me with the kind of composure one usually finds in galleries, the stillness of oil paint, and just as unrevealing. She wore a grey silk blouse that made her look like she belonged in another century, or perhaps another country altogether, something cooler. She stood among her roses, as if she had never expected them to bloom, and had decided to forgive them for doing so anyway. It was the sort of garden that made you forget the month. October by the calendar, but here against the rust of trellises and the sickle curve of pruning shears forgotten on a low wall, antique roses pressed out their last confessions in improbable clusters. A late flourish, a mistake of warmth. I doubted she'd correct them. She offered me a seat without touching my hand. There was already a glass of wine on the table, not hers. It bore a ghost of coral-pink lipstick and sat beside the opposite chair. She did not acknowledge it, and I did not reach for it. Her own glass, half drunk and perfectly chilled, remained in her left hand like punctuation. He admired this garden, you know, she said, not looking at it. But he never once helped me plant it. Said it was too temporal, too indulgent. Soil bored him. She was not grieving, not in any way one could call observable. Instead, she was adjusting. resetting her face with every phrase, a careful editor of her own expression. She spoke about Edwin as if he had already been anthologized, as though his life now belonged to other people's citations. I asked the usual questions, gently, and with more space between them than necessary. Whether he had enemies, whether he'd been ill, whether anything had recently unsettled him, she offered the usual answers. No enemies, only academic disagreements. Yes, his heart murmurs since his 30s, nothing sudden. And no, nothing strange in recent weeks. Except, she added after a beat, that he'd taken to sleeping in the cellar again. It was the word again that caught. I let it pass unremarked as if I had missed it. She brushed a petal from the table with the back of her hand. He didn't believe in heaven, if that's what you're wondering. Edwin thought we returned to ink and mildew, or not at all, and yet he wrote wills, I murmured. She smiled faintly. Old habits. One should at least decide who gets the fountain pens. I asked if she had a copy. His solicitor has the final version. But I've seen it. We made adjustments together, mostly small things, a few bequests to former students, the usual token nods to siblings he hadn't spoken to in years. The books go to the college, of course, and the name Claire Holden. It was the first time she looked directly at me. Not sharply, not defensively, just directly doctoral student, history faculty. He supervised her dissertation. Medieval burial customs, if I recall. She's clever, if a bit serious. Edwin thought she had promise. He left her his notebooks, and a small sum. Enough to raise eyebrows, I expect. Was she a source of tension? No, not that he shared, but she hesitated, and in that pause something slipped. Not guilt, not jealousy. Just the knowledge that another woman had known her husband through different doorways. I stood to leave. She didn't rise. You'll want to look at the cellar, she said, finally. The key still on the hook beside the stove. You won't find answers, but you might find what he was afraid of. As I walked past the forgotten wine glass, I noted the trace of lipstick. Pale rose, not Helena's shade, a guest who hadn't stayed, or perhaps one who had never quite left. The roses brushed against my sleeve as I passed. They smelled faintly of endings, not decay, just something that had outlived its appointment with the season. Martin's study had been left untouched, or so Helena had claimed, though I could feel the edits in the air. Books aligned with too much intention. A cardigan folded as though its owner had merely stepped out to the postbox. And yet it was the kind of careful disarray one associates with grief that needs to be seen, rather than felt. The room smelled faintly of rosemary and tobacco. The curtains, drawn to half measure, let in enough grey light to render every surface a little theatrical. I moved without touching anything for several minutes, a habit born less of respect than of ritual. Let the room speak first. On the oak desk and scored deeply where some ancient compass or letter opener had once scratched concentric scars, lay a small stack of poetry volumes. Not sentimental reading, not even romantic. These were texts for the weathered soul. Elegies and obscurities, the end of a season, chapel without saints. I reached for the Shelley, noting immediately the feel of it. Soft-edged, annotated, owned. Martin's copy. What caught me wasn't the underlining, though there was plenty of that. It was a single margin note beside a passage from Adonais, one of Shelley's longer keens for the dead. The line in the text read, "He hath awakened from the dream of life," but beside it, in a different hand, larger, angular, confident, someone had scrawled, "He has awakened from the dream of death, a subtle switch but unmistakable." Not Martin's error. He would have quoted from memory and quoted it correctly. The handwriting in the margin was also unfamiliar. Not Helena's refined loop, nor Claire's faint scholarly print, which I had seen in a paper she once submitted for a research grant. Instead, the initials, LH. The syllables had the unpleasant texture of something I ought to have remembered sooner. L.H. Lawrence Holden. Brother to Claire. Once a rising name in classics until something derailed. Plagiarism I'd heard in passing. Or perhaps just the quieter violence of irrelevance. Now a bookseller, antiquarian, the sort who speaks more to dust than people. His shop was tucked away off Cowley Road, behind a shutter that looked like it hadn't been opened willingly in years. A bell tinkled overhead as I entered, thin and apologetic. The air was layered, linseed oil, damp parchment, and something faintly metallic, as if disapproval had its own scent. He emerged from behind a curtain in the back, a man whose spine had clearly resigned some time ago. His eyes, though, were sharp, even beneath the yellow tint of nicotine-stained spectacles. "Inspector," he said. "Or is it Chief Inspector now?" I told him it was neither, and that I'd come about Martin. "A shame," he replied, already turning back toward the desk where a book lay open. "Heart, was it?" "It usually is," I murmured. He didn't offer a seat. I didn't ask. We exchanged a few pleasantries in the way that only scholars do, through titles, footnotes, and slight misquotes offered as provocations. He denied seeing Martin in the past year, said their paths had diverged after a panel on 14th century funerary rites had descended into polite acrimony. I doubted he remembered the panel or the acrimony. It was only as I turned to go that I saw it. On the counter, a first edition of Shelley's poetical works, near identical to the one in Martin's study. Leather slightly warped, corners blunted, and one particular line, page 173, faintly marked with a sliver of card protruding like a tongue held between teeth. I didn't ask. He wouldn't have answered. As I stepped back into the street, the drizzle had returned. Not rain exactly, just Oxford's way of reminding you it prefers questions over conclusions. And someone, perhaps Claire, perhaps Lawrence, had rewritten Shelley's line. From dream to death. Or was it the other way around? Either way, I had begun to suspect the dead weren't the only ones trying to wake. It was Lewis, naturally. He arrived late to the station with the photograph pressed between pages of a discarded alumni journal, the corners dog-eared by time and careless archivists. No triumph in his voice, just that quiet pride he never allowed himself to admit aloud. He handed it to me like a confession, found it in the college archives. Class of looks like 15 years ago. Took a while. They'd mislabeled the year. Typical. The image was monochrome but not dull. It had that strange luminescence only old photographs possess, as though everyone captured within had not yet fully resigned themselves to history. Faces pressed in rows, some grinning too widely, others with the fixed solemnity of those trained for posterity. But it was the arrangement, or the lack of it, that gave me pause. Helena Martin, though she'd still been Helena Dunleavy then, sat with her ankles crossed and her hands folded in her lap. There was something already sculptural about her, as if she'd arrived at the sitting fully formed. Beside her, Edwin Martin, younger but no less severe, held his academic gown closed with one hand. A gesture not of modesty but possession. Directly behind them, Lawrence Holden, youthful in frame yet prematurely burdened in gaze, the sort of expression that prefigures retreat. He looked not at the camera but somewhere past it, as if already rewriting the moment in his mind. And off to the side, barely within the composition, stood Claire. Half-turned, not smiling. Not unkind, just absent. Her body faced the group, but her eyes did not. A woman undecided about being seen. The distance between her and the others wasn't physical so much as emotional, and even in the stillness of the image, it hummed. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him not yet, but it would. That evening I returned to the college under the softened hush of twilight. Evensong had begun in the chapel. The choir's voices rose like breath held too long. No urgency, just the ache of release. I slipped into the back pew, letting the familiar melancholy of the Nunc Dimittis settle around me. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. The phrase, so final, felt less like permission and more like instruction. The words echoed off the stone ribs and lingered beneath the timbered roof where candlelight quivered in half-surrender. It was then I saw her. Claire. She had been seated 2 rows ahead, alone. No hymn book, no glance toward the altar, just a figure folded into herself, as if listening not to the choir but to something within. And then, quietly and without coat or ceremony, she rose, not hurried, not hesitant, but early. She moved toward the side aisle, past the rood screen, and through the small wooden door that led eventually to the vestry, and then the crypt stair. No one followed. No heads turned, but I did. By the time I reached the transept, she had already vanished from view. I paused at the threshold, feeling again that faint pressure, the same presence I had sensed 2 nights ago in the Undercroft. Not quite dread, more like inevitability. I did not follow her then, not yet. Whatever she sought in the darkness, she had sought before. That much was clear, and people do not return to such places for discovery. They return for remembrance, or for concealment. Back in the chapel, the choir was finishing their final verse. Peace had become refrain, and Claire, I suspected, was chasing a version of it she had once believed in, buried perhaps, alongside something that had refused to stay buried. The photograph, folded in my pocket, pressed faintly against my chest, a gallery of faces each looking inward, except hers, the one who turned away, the one who now silently returned. It was the tapestry that returned to me, a worn thing, florid and ecclesiastical, depicting some obscure saint mid-gesture beside a lion with a crown. I had passed it twice before in the crypt, neither time giving it more than a reverent glance, as one does with inherited ornaments. But tonight, with the choir's echoes still curling in my ears and Claire's absence trailing behind like smoke, I looked again. The weave had faded, not just with time, but with touch. The fabric sagged faintly along its lower edge, and when I stepped closer, the scent of mildew thickened. There beneath the hem, 2 small holes bored into stone, mounting pegs, rusted, and behind the tapestry, when lifted, a door, or rather the ghost of one, a frame, timber swollen and slick with time, its hinges buried in plaster. The bolt, however, was visible, still drawn, a dead mechanism from the inside out. I let the tapestry fall gently and stood for a moment in the hush. Then came the memory, uninvited like most of them. It was something the janitor, Darnley, that was his name, had muttered when Lewis and I had passed through earlier that week. "No one's used that side since '78, sir. Not since the flood." At the time it had struck me as one of those Oxfordisms, half fact, half law, all memory. But now, like sediment shifting in the Thames, it began to reveal a shape, the flood. I returned to the porter's lodge the next morning and requested the maintenance records, not through channels, but through Purdy, whose loyalty could be coaxed by 2 things, shared grievances and the occasional cigarette. He retrieved the old volumes reluctantly, dusting them off with theatrical disdain. Most of it was rot and plumbing, burst pipes, frost cracks, leaks in ceilings long since replaced. But buried near the back of the 1978 volume, in faint red ink, was a single line: "Subsidence reported in Tunnel A2. Side passage sealed per Warden's directive. Access rerouted via main crypt. Records relocated. There was a sketched diagram. Rudimentary but enough. The tunnel, once used by staff to reach the wine cellar without disturbing the cloister paths above, had been bricked off. Forgotten in the architectural sense, but remembered in the kind of memory that survives floods. Lewis met me at dusk, the torch already flickering in his hand as if reluctant to serve. "I don't like tunnels, sir," he said quietly as we ducked through the arch. "Then think of it as a very old corridor with no windows," I offered. We entered where the crypt's wall gave way, not dramatically, but with a slump of mortar and a change in smell. The air shifted, colder, bitter with the acidic edge of damp chalk and old wood. The tunnel sloped slightly, dust dampened into silence beneath our feet. The walls here were closer, the ceiling lowered. The sound of our own breath returned too quickly. After 10 or 12 yards, the torchlight caught on a collapse, not entire but broken enough to force caution. Lewis steadied a fallen beam and we pressed forward. That's when we saw it, the secondary entrance. A half-door in the far wall, its arch blackened, and just before it, on the ground, something charred. A parchment. I knelt. The edges were curled, the ink half lost, but enough remained. I confess that I have hidden the name and the stone beneath it. May the saints forgive what reason could not. It mimicked the style of a medieval hand, not wholly authentic, but fluent enough to pass. A copy, perhaps, or a draft of something meant to appear ancient. The burn was deliberate, not incidental, staged. Someone had wanted this found and not found. I looked at Lewis. They wanted a tomb, sir. No, they wanted a story, and we just disturbed it. Puccini's Tosca had reached the midpoint, that suspended ache before Act 3 where music becomes memory, when my phone shivered silently against my leg. I ignored it at first. The soprano had just stilled the stage, and for a moment I let myself believe in the purity of her sorrow. But even grief, especially when rehearsed, cannot outsing a vibrating call from Chief Superintendent Strange. I stepped into the theatre's corridor, thick with velvet and the cologne of donors. Strange's voice carried the usual ration of exasperation. That parchment you found, lab's finished with it. Ink's no older than your tie. Someone had a go at medieval Latin, but it's textbook stuff. Plural where singular should have been. Wrong ligature in miserere. Even I spotted it, a forgery. Poorly done. A ghost conjured with the subtlety of a school play. I thanked him and rang off. I should have returned to the performance. Let the music finish what it started. Instead, I moved toward the rear corridor, where shadows of opera masks and false staircases offered another kind of performance. That was where I saw her, Claire. She stood alone near the stage door, her eyes red-rimmed, hair pulled back with the kind of care that unravels in moments of fear. She didn't startle when she saw me. Just looked, the way some people do when they've already decided not to lie and regret it. You followed me, she said quietly. Not this time. She nodded, almost grateful. He was paying for everything, she said. My research, my travel, even the binding for my thesis. In return, I gave him access to the crypt. Just for his work, he said. For the truth, you believed him? I wanted to. No one else believed in what I was writing. No one except she stopped. Not even Lawrence. She didn't move, but her hand drifted instinctively to her chest, fingers curling around the pendant there, a small silver cross. Tarnished at the edges, had its base a single onyx bead chipped, a fragment, a clue. But not new, I had seen it before, in the photograph. Lawrence standing behind the seated crowd, his gaze elsewhere. The same necklace around his neck, worn not with pride, but as something kept for its weight. Claire followed my glance. It was my brother's, she said. He gave it to me when I turned 16. Said it was our mother's. I don't even know if that's true. Why wear it now? Because it reminds me not to trust people who promise protection. She spoke it without accusation, just fact, as though it had taken years to pare the emotion from it. Do you think he's capable of it? I asked. She didn't ask who. Didn't pretend to misunderstand, Lawrence. Yes, he's capable of loneliness and bitterness, the kind that turns inward and then outward again. But murder? She paused. That's a different kind of discipline. She reached into her bag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. No theatrics, just the weariness of someone tired of withholding. He gave me this, a week before Martin died. Said if anything happened, I should destroy it. It was a map, a crude one, ink smudged from folding. It matched the tunnel we'd walked, the sealed passage to the old cellar. But here, marked in red, was a note, stone lifted, vault exposed. Reseal before 1 o'clock, the dates mattered now. So did the carelessness. I looked back at her. Claire's face was unreadable again, but the tears remained. The opera ended somewhere behind us in a swell of applause. But I knew, standing there in the wings with a forgery in my pocket and a real secret in my hand, that the true performance was only just beginning. Helena summoned me with the solemnity of a woman preparing to be absolved. We sat again in her garden, though the roses had given up now, their petals browned and brittle, heads bowed like mourners after a long vigil. She handed me the envelope with no embellishment. Inside a will typed, dated 2 weeks before Martin's death. Everything, the house, the money, the annotated manuscripts, left to Claire Holden. No mention of Helena, no mention of anyone else, just a clean, abrupt line of succession. It's unsigned, she said. I found it in his desk drawer, tucked inside a book on medieval funerary rites. Perhaps he was planning to change things. Perhaps he wanted her to have it all. But it never happened, did it? She didn't look at me as she spoke. Her voice was even, but too carefully so, as though she'd rehearsed neutrality and was now struggling to keep the performance upright. You're giving this to me freely? Yes, because if I don't, someone else will. And because I don't believe she killed him. And you? I no longer believe he died by chance. She sipped something colorless from a highball glass and said nothing more. The rest she left unspoken. Back at my flat, I laid the will beside the original. The differences were plain, yet the implications refused to settle. It was emotive and blunt and clear, but like most blunt instruments, it didn't belong in this particular composition. Claire had many qualities, but neatness was not one of them. If she'd forged the confession parchment or tampered with the will, I doubted she'd have done it with such restraint. And Martin had been no fool. He would not have risked a rewritten testament without cause or witness. I turned back to the Shelley. I hadn't returned to it in days. The margin still held the false Shelley quote and the LH initials, but now I flipped more slowly. And there, near the end, between Prometheus Unbound and a faded pencil sketch of an urn, I found it. A flower, pressed flat, bone-dry, petals discolored with time but unmistakably once white. Lily of the valley, I thought. Or possibly hellebore. Not modern, not slipped between pages absent-mindedly. This had the texture of age, of grief preserved. And it carried something else. A faint, chalky scent like the kind you find in sealed places. A coffin bouquet, perhaps. I sealed it in an evidence pouch and rang Lewis. "Get back to the crypt," I said. "I want eyes on those tombs, especially the sealed ones. And don't let the verger brush you off," he grumbled, as he always does, but within the hour he was there. I waited, and waited longer. Then the call. "It's strange, sir. There's one sarcophagus. Far wall, south side. The lid's not flush. Only by a bit, but you can feel the gap." I tried lifting it, but it's too heavy. No chisel marks. No new dust either. Could it have shifted naturally? He paused. "Not likely. Not on its own. And there's wax on the floor again. A small smear, fresh, and something else. The same salter's been moved. Back on the table. Spine aligned now. Someone's been back since you were here." I said nothing for a moment. Just let the crypt hum in the distance through the silence of the line. "Leave it," I said. "Don't touch the lid again." "We'll come back tomorrow, quietly." The will had been too loud, the parchment too clumsy. But the flower, that small brittle thing nestled between poetry and dust, that was real. Whoever had disturbed the tomb hadn't done so to hide something. They had opened it for remembrance. And someone, I now suspected, had been mourning long before the murder began. Sleep would have been a kindness, but I had passed the threshold where such graces visit. The Psalter sat before me on the desk, modest, cracked at the spine, the kind of book that survives less from preservation than from being forgotten in the right place. I opened it slowly, page by page, as one might turn the linens of a long-abandoned bed, aware that what lies beneath is not necessarily restful. Psalm 88, the darkest of them all. No plea for salvation, no hallelujah to rescue the end. Just silence, despair unembellished. "Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps." The page had been dog-eared, not carelessly, but with the precision of someone who wanted the mark to be noticed, eventually. It was the only crease in the book. I traced the fold lightly, then flicked the pages once more. That's when I found it. A note no larger than a calling card folded once. Inside a verse, not biblical, not liturgical, but cloaked in the cadence of old rhymes, where stone lips part but make no sound, where prayers decay beneath the ground, there lies the hymn that none have sung. The dead man's truth with borrowed tongue, a riddle, or rather a key masquerading as one, the mouth of the dead that sang no hymn, the phrase nagged. Not in its metaphor, but its geometry. Stone lips, a sarcophagus perhaps, but not just any, one posed or carved with a face. A monument designed to be seen, not merely sealed. I thought of the crypt again, its quiet carvings, the smoothed lid slightly ajar, the smear of wax, the faint scent of ash and candle smoke that lingered even in memory. And suddenly the pattern clicked. This wasn't concealment, it was performance. The crypt hadn't been used as a tomb alone. It had become a stage, a place where shame could be recast as silence, where the past could be reenacted with enough ritual to feel redemptive, but not enough to be absolved. Martin's death had not been about scholarship or wills. That was the set dressing. The footnotes to a darker chapter. It was about something buried, not just in stone, but in time. I went back to the photograph, 15 years ago, perhaps more. Helena with her folded hands. Martin already wearing the look of a man who prefers his history bound and unbreathing. Lawrence brooding behind the others. And Claire, not quite turned toward the group, on the periphery of her own story. But it was the date that mattered now, and what had happened just before it. The flood, the sealing of the tunnel. And as Darnley had once said without intention, the last time anyone used the side entrance to the crypt. I thought of Lawrence then, the necklace once his, now worn by Claire, the forged parchment. The reluctance in his answers, not rooted in deceit but in something messier, grief disguised as contempt or perhaps the reverse. I rang Lewis before dawn. We need to reopen that tomb, sir, the one with the loosened lid. South wall, and get Darnley. He'll remember. Back at the crypt under torchlight and the hush of old stones bearing witness, we lifted the lid with effort. Dust rose, the scent of time unkind and sudden, inside the expected bones, but also folded into the hollow where once a heart had beat. A cloth pouch. Within it fragments, a scorched clerical collar, a bishop's seal, letters, pages torn from a journal, each bearing the same name, the man who'd vanished in 78, a college priest. Rumors once dismissed, a scandal hushed by storm and circumstance, and Martin had found it all, not to reveal but to relive, to recreate the confession, in candlelight in chant beneath the chapel where nobody sang anymore. I stared down at the bones and knew the hymn was never meant to be sung. It was meant to be buried. And Martin, in the end, had chosen to lie with it. It was the music master who filled in the final silences. We sat together in the practice room, thin light filtering through leaded windows, motes rising in a slow ballet over the piano lid. The master, a spare man named Halverson, wore a brown cardigan that hung from his frame like regret. His fingers tapped the edge of his teacup in quiet syncopation, a habit that had probably begun during evensong and never quite stopped. "You've come about the boy, haven't you?" he said before I could speak. I nodded. "He didn't ask how I knew Louis Halden," he said, looking past me. Clear soprano, not a trace of self-consciousness in his tone. "Some boys, when they sing, you hear the effort. Others, it's like the note was waiting in the air for them to arrive. Louis was like that, and the accident." That word again. It hung in the room like the wrong chord, officially a fall. He stayed behind after rehearsal. Said he'd left his hymn book in the crypt. They found him at the bottom of the stairwell, skull fractured. It was raining, they said, slippery, plausible. But the hymn book wasn't there. And the page in the register, the one that should have shown he'd signed out, was missing. The dean said there was no need for alarm. No scandal. Just tragedy. He was 12. The cup in his hands trembled once before he set it down. And the family? They vanished. The parents never recovered. Claire stopped singing. Lawrence? Well, he was already beginning to unlearn kindness by then. I left him in the stillness of old keys and locked cabinets, and walked back through the quad toward the bookseller's shop. Lawrence didn't flinch when I arrived. He was behind the counter again, sleeves rolled, hands inked faintly with age. The Shelley was gone. In its place, a ledger deliberately blank. You've come to ask about Louis, he said. No, I've come to ask about you. He gave a breath that was neither sigh nor laugh, more a release of something that had been tightening across years. I never meant for it to go that far. Then tell me how far you meant it to go. He didn't speak immediately. Just walked around the counter, fingers brushing spines like a man revisiting rooms long shut. Martin was always afraid, not of being found out. That would have given him definition. No, he feared memory, its persistence, its unwillingness to degrade with time. I wanted to remind him. So you forged the parchment. Yes, Latin was my first language after silence. I made it just clumsy enough. He'd know it was a trap. That was the point. And the Psalter, his, I borrowed it years ago. Slipped the note in after the funeral. Psalm 88. No light, no redemption. Just descent. He used to say the crypt should be stripped of its sacredness. I wanted him to see it again as a place of reckoning. And the tomb, already disturbed. I'd seen him go down there. Knew he'd found something done or someone. So I left traces, wax, the flower. Moved things. Enough to awaken guilt. But guilt's a tricky fuel. He stopped, knuckles pressed white against the wall. When he didn't break, I confronted him. I said the name. Louis. Said I remembered the way Martin had taken him aside that evening. Said he'd help him with his Latin. And I said I remembered the way Louis looked the next morning, not there and Martin. He didn't deny it. He said it was complicated. That grief wasn't proof. That the past was a fragile fiction, and you? I struck him. Just once he fell, hit his head on the hearth. It wasn't supposed to, he didn't finish. I didn't prompt him. The past, I thought, has a way of turning collectors into curators and curators into vandals. I left him in the shop, beside the blank ledger. The man who had wanted only to hear a name spoken aloud again, even if it cost him everything. The chapel was empty, save for the slow, uncertain chords drifting from the organ loft. A student, nameless, no doubt earnest, rehearsed the Kyrie with the delicacy of someone afraid to be overheard. Each note lingered a breath too long, as if waiting for permission. I remained seated in the rear pew, coat folded beside me, the Psalter open in my lap like a conversation interrupted. The crypt was sealed now. Not ceremonially. No Latin, no incense. Just mortar and cold stone set without flourish. Lawrence had signed his statement the morning prior. The Crown would do what it does, manslaughter, mitigating circumstances. A lifetime trim to 10 or 12 years, maybe less. He hadn't resisted. If anything, he seemed grateful. Like a man finally allowed to put down a weight that had fused to the shape of his spine. Claire had vanished. No forwarding address, no note. Her fellowship had been rescinded quietly, another line redacted from a footnote that would now never be cited. I imagined her in a borderless city, somewhere with white walls and no crypts, leaving the necklace in a drawer she would never open again. Some people flee shame. Others escape it by forgetting they ever held it. I ran a thumb along the Psalter's spine. Psalm 88 still bore the fold, still offered its bleak surrender without apology. The flower I had found within now pressed between glass stored at the station, evidence though of what no one could say. A souvenir from grief. Louis entered quietly, as he always did when unsure of his welcome. He sat beside me with the stiffness of someone unused to stillness. They're saying the Crown might push for a plea deal, he said. Diminished responsibility. It won't bring the boy back. No, it never does. He nodded, waited, and Claire, Gaunt, that sat between us for a while. Then I murmured, more to the chapel than to him, "We bury the wrong things." Lewis turned his head. "Sir, we bury secrets. We bury voices, but not shame, that we keep above ground, polish it, explain it into something manageable." Until it wakes, the organist struck a wrong chord. A dissonant throb against the quiet. "Sorry," came a voice from the loft. "It's all right," I called back. "Let it breathe." He resumed, gentler now. I could feel Lewis watching me, his patience a kind of question. Why a psalter? Why all the theatre? Because Lawrence wanted a confession, not for the courts but for the crypt. He wanted Martin to name the boy, to give his voice back. He wanted justice to echo where the hymn had been cut off. And did he get it? No, he got silence. As we all do eventually, the light shifted through the stained glass above us, fractured color landing in slivers on the floor. Rubies, sapphires, gold. Dust hung suspended like forgotten snow. I thought of Lewis Hulden then, not the boy as corpse or name on a coroner's sheet, but as a voice. Clear, rising, unfinished. A single note struck too young, still ringing out somewhere in the vaulted silence. "Do you believe in ghosts, Lewis?" He blinked. "No, sir. Only in the weight of things left unsaid." I smiled faintly. "That'll do." We sat there longer than we needed to. The student finished the Kyrie and began again. Outside, the rain had started once more. Not dramatic, just persistent. Like Oxford remembering something in low murmurs. The sort of rain that never quite arrives or leaves. The case was closed. The files would be shelved. The psalter would return to its glass case, restored and inert. But in my head, and perhaps only mine, the boy still sang a voice beneath the stone, soft, unanswered, and I, like the rest of them, too late to listen.